afternoon. I'm Jay Barth. I'm the director of the Clinton Presidential Library and Museum, and we're thrilled to see you here today. Presidential centers and the foundations that support them are real hubs of civic engagement and real cornerstones of their community, and I think we certainly know that to be the case here in Little Rock. And this year, we're welcoming the leaders of some of these institutions to come to Little Rock to talk about their work. And they come from across the political spectrum and from across the country. Our first guest is Tina Tchen. She is the Executive Vice President of Programs for the Obama Foundation and Chief Strategy and Impact Officer for the foundation. There, she is responsible for leading the development and implementation of the foundation's strategy. Tchen also oversees the Girls Opportunity Alliance, the Obama Foundation program that works to empower adolescent girls around the world through completing their education. Tina is an attorney, an activist, and lifelong advocate for women and girls, and you're going to hear about her life story today. She served in the Obama White House through both terms and was an assistant to President Barack Obama, Chief of Staff to First Lady Michelle Obama, and Executive Director of the White House Council on Women and Girls. At the White House, Tina spearheaded the first ever White House Summit on Working Families, helped form the White House Task Force to protect students from sexual assault, and led the administration's efforts to promote education for adolescent girls worldwide, including Mrs. Obama's Let Girls Learn initiative. Prior to the White House, Tina practiced law for 23 years at Skadden. At that firm, she was a corporate litigation partner, chaired the pro bono committee, and was a longtime leader of the American Bar Association's section on litigation. Joining Tina for this conversation about the post-presidential work of the Obama Foundation, locally in Chicago and globally, along with the coming opening of the Obama Presidential Center, is Stephanie Street, my colleague and the executive director of the Clinton Foundation. Stephanie, take it away.
Thank you, Jay. Well, welcome, everybody. I'm excited to welcome you back to Little Rock. We had the opportunity to speak on a program just a couple of weeks ago, it seems like, at I guess it was last year, technically, at the Rotary Club of Little Rock, which meets here. But I'm excited to have this opportunity today to really focus on the post-presidency. When President Clinton and Secretary Clinton, I guess she was Senator Clinton then, left the White House, they were in their 50s and still wanting to continue to work on issues they cared about deeply. And that work obviously happens through the Clinton Center here, through the Clinton Global Initiative, and some of our other programs that allow them to continue helping people live better lives. And I know similarly with the Obamas, they are still very young when they left, and it's obvious that they're not ready just to fade into the sunset. They are working really hard to continue working on issues they care about. So all of that happens through the presidential foundations. That is the vehicle for that work to continue. So I'd like to kind of start from the beginning after they left the White House. I'd love to just hear you talk about, I know you have some slides to talk about the campus itself. It's very exciting. We are thrilled, as are all of our other presidential foundations, because each new presidential library is exciting. We all rally around it. We don't see it as competition. We see it as, oh my gosh, another crown jewel. So maybe people will come see you and they'll think, oh, I want to go see the Clinton Center, and they'll come see us and, oh, Obama's the newest one. So tell us about the Obama Center.
Well, thank you, Stephanie, and it's great to be back. The weather here is so much nicer than the snowstorm I left in Chicago last night. So I'm delighted to be here, and really this is so timely, and it's great to be here to talk about the Obama Presidential Center and the work of the Obama Foundation, because now that we're into 2025, I realize that actually I can say that we will open next year.
Yay!
We are opening the Presidential Center next spring of
Okay.
2026. So we're really gearing towards that. But I'm excited. I'm going to just spin through a few slides here
Please
just to
do.
tell you about the overall work of the foundation itself and the Presidential Center, as a part of that. So as you see in the quote here, President Obama has really, in this post-presidency, really been thinking about democracy and the broader themes of democracy and young people and
How
leadership.
timely.
How timely. How timely. And so, let's see.
Oh.
Is that? There we go. Whoops. So, that is our mission. It is really a vision and a world where an active democratic culture promotes positive change. So really focusing all of our work on that active democratic culture. And we do that by inspiring, empowering, connecting people to change their world. Now, sort of pay attention to those four hands, the shape that those four hands form when they are brought together, because that is the shape of this building. So this is the 8-story museum tower that is the centerpiece of our 19-acre campus. It is inspired by the shape of those four hands, because you can only make that shape when four hands come together to work together to make it. It's been an interesting construction challenge because no four walls of that building are straight or the same. So our architects and our construction team, but we're topped off. And all the buildings on the campus are topped off now. The words that are in that text screen that you see there, those will be installed actually in just a couple of months. They are an excerpt from President Obama's speech at the 50th anniversary of the crossing of the Edmund Pettus Bridge, where he talks about, oh, what a glorious task we all have to constantly remake this country of ours, really carrying forward that theme, about democracy. And then these are our pillars of change. So like, President Clinton and Secretary Clinton, the President, Obama didn't want to wait for the building. The campus is only one piece of the work. So since he left the White House over the last, whatever that is now, 12 years, we have been,
12 years.
Yeah, we have been, working on a variety of programs around the world. We really see our levers for change around participation, opportunity, and trust, trying to, really encourage participation of citizens in a democracy, because that's what you need for an active democracy. We do that through our Global Leaders Program. We have a leaders program that trains leaders around the world, mid-career in a leadership program on values-based leadership, a graduate student programs at Columbia and the University of Chicago. And then Brian Chesky from Airbnb has endowed what we call the Voyager program, which is for juniors and seniors. We got a Voyager here. And you're working on the work, right? A Voyager program for juniors and seniors who might otherwise not be able to afford to take a summer voyage between junior and senior year to learn about public service and a passion project. Participation is also at the heart of what we do, at the museum, is to teach and encourage citizens to be inspired by, as they learn about the Obama administration, to take their own action. Opportunity is because without equal opportunity, you can't have a democracy, right?
That's
Every
right.
citizen needs to have, and believe in that ability that they can get, bring themselves and their families forward. Our programs around the Girls Opportunity Alliance, which is Mrs. Obama's signature program to help promote adolescent girls around the world completing their education, and in Chicago contributes to that, as does My Brother's Keeper, which is the program we started in the White House to support young men and boys of color and their success, and we now do that across the country in the U.S. And then finally, trust, because unless we trust in each other and in our institutions, we can't have a democracy. We do an annual democracy forum every year where we talk about those themes and bring together activists and thought leaders and students to talk about democracy. And it's also what we'll see, throughout the museum and the campus. And the president has been very involved in what we here call the Hope to Action values. And our curriculum for our training our leaders has been based on these 10 values that we really see as, and he saw as some of how he was able to do the work that he did. And we try to train our leaders to have this shared sense of values. And we try to implement them sort of throughout, our work, things like hope and resilience and inclusion and pragmatism. And then here's the campus. So like you, Stephanie, we are on a lot of acreage. So we sit on, nearly 20 acres of Chicago Park District land. If you know Chicago and have ever been to the Museum of Science and Industry, we sit just south of there on the lakefront, adjacent to Jackson Park. And you'll see there's a lagoon at the top of that slide, sort of, on the other side of that walkway that we border, going sort of left to right, really quick orientation. We sit on the site of the 1890 World Exposition, and we have rehabilitated the Women's Garden from that exposition, which is on the far left, on the north end of the campus. The yellow square is that museum building that just showed you the picture of. Next to the museum is a 2-story forum building that will house a 300-seat auditorium, our restaurant, classrooms, a production quality audio media center where kids can learn how to cut records or do a podcast. The kind of hash-marked building is a branch of the Chicago Public Library. The kind of green blob on the top of that is to represent, there is a fruit and vegetable garden on the roof of the Chicago Public Library, and a nod to Mrs. Obama's fruit and vegetable garden at the White House, and we will have adjacent to it a garden classroom to do classroom activities. Those 3 buildings surround that dark blue box, which is an open-air forum called the John Lewis Plaza, which will be our central gathering space. That is our naming conventions. As donors gave money to not name it for themselves, but for a civil rights hero. The fruit and vegetable garden is the Eleanor Roosevelt Garden, for example. Then our parking garage, which we've terraformed over to create a hill, to create that great lawn that you see for concerts or just for lounging and kite flying. 1.5 acre playground in pink. And then at the far south end in that orange square, we will have a freestanding NBA quality basketball court, of course, called Home Court.
I love it.
Right, that will also have classrooms. It'll also be our largest gathering space. You could seat 1,000 people there for an event. And then, it all sits on open parkland. The only ticketed space is the museum space. We will have about 24 original commissioned works of art from people like Maya Lin. We just installed an 80-foot tall painted glass installation by Julie Meritou on the north facade of the building. And most of those artwork will be free. They'll be in the free and open, non-ticketed spaces for people to come onto the parkland and enjoy it. Free high-speed Wi-Fi through the whole 19 acres. So, we want kids from the neighborhood as well as world leaders to come have their lunch, sit in that space, and sort of interact with each other. Let me see what else I've got here, real quickly. We border 3 of the most disinvested neighborhoods in Chicago, South Shore, Woodlawn, and Washington Park, so we very much have wanted to do our development in a responsible way and invest in those neighborhoods. This gives you just a sense of the kind of spaces that I just described and, the variety of programming, that we hope to do from, speaker series to teaching, garden moments, to sort of classroom kinds of activities. And this is just a little bit of some of the statistics. I won't go through them, but we've really tried to intentionally train people to be diverse workforce on our construction site. We're 50% women and people of color, for example, which is unheard of on a construction site. And how we're trying to expand that. And then, oops, that's not that. That's briefly just the economic development, that we expect to flow into the neighborhood once we're open, and how we're going to do that. So that's sort of a very fast overview.
That is so exciting. Well, we will wait with bated breath, and definitely will be excited to share with our visitors as well what's going to be happening there, so that they too will hopefully come visit. I want to talk a little bit. I want to switch a little bit to talk about you. When our Presidential Center opened, and still today, President Clinton wanted the building, our exhibits, our programs to really underscore to young people that public service is a noble profession. We're sitting in the Clinton School of Public Service. So I would like you to talk a little bit about how your journey in public service began, and how did you meet the Obamas? Give us your sort of origin story of going to the White House.
Oh, well, I'll also try to do this quick because I'm old, Stephanie, so there's like a lot of years. Again, well, I'm trying to do this quickly. And some of I often say, how I got here was a lot of just being in the right place at the right time.
Same.
So I graduated from college. I grew up in Cleveland, graduated from college at an East Coast school in 1978, but got married to somebody from Chicago, so how I wound up in Illinois. And not just Illinois, I wound up in the capital in Springfield, Illinois, in 1978, which just so happened to be, I actually have a couple slides on this, just so happened to be the time when Springfield, Illinois was the hotbed of American feminism, because you'll remember, 1978 to 81 was the extension period to get the ERA ratified, the Equal Rights Amendment ratified to the U.S. Constitution. And Illinois was the only northern industrial state that had not ratified and was viewed as key to getting the other 2 additional states we needed. We just needed 3. And so, everybody came to Springfield, Illinois. Ellie Smale, Gloria Steinem, and Phyllis Schlafly. So if you've watched Mrs. America, this is how Phyllis Schlafly got her start was, she was from Southern Illinois, organized the anti-ERA movement. This is a picture of sort of the national rally that we did in 1981 as the extension was coming to a close. So I'm Olive, just a heady, young, 20-something, became president of Springfield Now, so somewhere in that crowd, I'm holding that sign there, when we were doing these rallies, and that's sort of how I got really started doing gender equity work, which I continued to do. I went to law school in Chicago after this. Oh, these are the rallies we used to go to. So you can see we're in green and white. And we used to, I was telling someone, we used to, during my lunch hour, as though I worked for state government for the governor, who we were lucky to have a Republican governor who was very supportive of the ERA, Jim Thompson. We'd wear our green and white and go down to the rotunda and scream across the rotunda at Phyllis's folks in red and white. It was a very, very, very heady time. What's the next picture? So I went to law school in Chicago after then. Again, right place, right time. When I was in the middle of being in Chicago and in law school in 1983 is when Harold Washington ran for mayor to become the first black mayor of the city of Chicago. And this is me with Harold. We're standing at the podium when he announced in 1987 his reelection campaign. You may, a lot of you are too young to remember this, but that particular election was marked by it is when the old Chicago machine, the old man Daley's machine was finally defeated, was the most openly racist machine. It was a 3-way primary race. Old man Daley's son, Rich Daley, was surprised and defeated by this, black congressman, Harold Washington. So all the machine Democrats got behind the Republican, and it was an openly racist campaign. His first term was then 27 of the Chicago councilmen who were old school just openly defied him. They would have fights on the council floor, jumped on the tables, all sorts of things. So him running for re-election was sort of a big deal. He announced it at a group we started. That Cook County Democratic Women Banner is a group that several of us started right after he was elected to elect more women to office. Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky's one of our sort of proudest, we got her start, as well as our current Cook County board president. And that's how I got to know, we don't know exactly when I met Barack and Michelle Obama, because the 3 of us tried, but it was probably right around then. Because he was kind of doing his voter project, and I was doing a gender vote project. We kind of been, but it goes back that far to the 80s. And then here I am. So, just never know. I was a lawyer, as Jay said in the opening, but I always did Democratic politics on the side. And that's what I used to tell the White House interns is I can't tell you how to get the White House except a guy I knew, got elected, and his wife. But this picture is taken in that colonnade, between the Oval Office and the residence. And this is when I was Mrs. Obama's chief of staff during that time period. So that's kind of the story.
Do you have your favorite or fond moment from your time in the White House that you want to talk about? There's probably so many. It's hard to choose. There's so many.
So it is because each day is astonishing and really. It's hard. It is really hard to pick. A lot of us talk about the day when when gay marriage was approved by the Supreme Court, and we were leaving that day for the funeral in Charleston, of Reverend Pinckney and the Charleston church massacre, and that's the one where President Obama is saying, Amazing Grace. Actually, I sat behind Secretary Clinton. I remember that day, and I remember her turning around and saying, oh, "That was amazing," and just in the way she does that.
Yeah.
And then we got on Air Force One, and not everybody knew. I told the President and the First Lady, but we had been experimenting with this idea of, were we to win the gay marriage decision, lighting the White House in the rainbow colors, which we had to sort of do in secret. Turns out it's actually really hard to do, because getting that color separation, with different
right.
spotlights is actually really hard. It's also really expensive. So I had to find somebody, to help me do that, and secretly test it. Like, we had to secretly test it, in the back of the White House so the press wouldn't see it, in the days leading up to it. And then it was a surprise when we lit it up, and I remember, just this spontaneous party erupted
Right.
on the North Lawn for the staffers, and then in Lafayette Park across the street. I watched several proposals happen on the North Lawn, which was,
that's so special.
people proposing. And Mrs. Obama writes about this in her book. I then left. I stayed because we'd gotten up really early. So about 10 o'clock, I went home. Well, about 11 o'clock, there was still a ruckus going on, and she and Malia decided they wanted to sneak out to see it. They were headed out the front door before the Secret Service said, there's a lot of cameras, Mrs. Obama, if you go out that front door, let's take you down through the back and the underground, which they wound up doing. So nobody actually, recorded that she went out there, but they did go out to sort of, experience that themselves.
That's awesome. That's really special. Let's go back to the building for a second. I'd like to know a little bit about the selection process, like how and why you selected the site you did, and then also talk a little bit about how the community responded. I don't know if some of you will remember when we first announced the site and started working on the plans, there was some local opposition and some controversy around it, and I know you all experienced to have, and maybe something else is going on now that it's, tell us a little bit about it.
Well, we're Chicago, so there's like a dispute about everything.
Right.
in Chicago. The selection process started when we were still in the White House.
Right.
So, we formed, the Obama Foundation while we were still in the White House in, late 2015, and then, put out a request for bids from
Right.
folks, and got a lot of really amazing bids from some amazing architects and local institutions. Narrowed the final selection down to 3. It was Columbia, University of Chicago, and I think University of Hawaii was not in the final, but we knew we were going to have some relationship with them, and a University of Illinois site in Chicago. And there was just a few of us that did the review with the architects, with the folks, and the final kind of selection was, like, who wouldn't want to be on the lakefront? I remember we were looking at the University of Chicago proposed a site that's a little bit west of the lakefront, and then this lakefront site. And, I remember the president sort of saying, well, yeah, I kind of think we want to be on the lakefront, if you know the Chicago lakefront. Now, once we did that, anytime you pick,
Oh, yes.
anytime in Chicago, you pick a site on the Chicago lakefront, which, is famously designed by Frederick Olmsted. The Olmsted Plan is a heavily revered, plan in Chicago history. Anytime anybody proposes something on the lakefront, a group called Friends of the Parks and others rally to prevent any changes. They famously prevented, Steven Spielberg was going to put his, or the Lucas Museum, rather, George Lucas was going to put his Lucas Museum, that's now going up in Los Angeles, on the lakefront in Chicago as his original site. And they sued him, to which he finally gave up and said, well, I don't really need to do this. Well, we didn't really have that choice, because we, of course, wanted to be in Chicago. Because folks were worried about the trees and about disturbing the lakefront. We actually took over, we don't have the map up, but there's a walkway on the east side of it at the top of that map, and that actually used to be a 6-lane, street that basically operated like a highway almost. I remember having this fight with somebody at the parks and said, you're disturbing Olmsted's plan and you're taking away Cornell Drive, and I said, I kind of think when Olmsted designed it as a carriageway, he didn't really think it was going to be a 6-lane highway for people to go 60 miles an hour. We're kind of restoring it. We overcame all of those, and also overcame, that's why we're so devoted to those neighborhoods.
Right.
Is, as people have seen us, I think employ people in the neighborhoods, do training for them. We actually set up a separate 501c3 called Emerald South to do economic development in the neighborhoods. So they've gotten several $1 million to do, vacant land reclamation. They're right now doing a small business development effort. And hopefully, a lot of the programming that we're going to do will be targeted to the young people or to the people in the community there in the first instance.
That's exciting. I was sitting here thinking about, we're in the middle of planning for a major expansion for the center, and really thinking about not just the building and the grounds, which will be great, and really the burgeoning East Village here. It's really exciting to think about being part of that community, but just thinking about like the impact. How do we continue making an impact here on the community? That's something that's important to the Clintons, and clearly that's something that's important to the Obamas.
And look, we're honest about the challenges too, because you can make an impact and it just gentrifies, right?
Sure.
So, but that's part of why we have Emerald South there, is to try to do some creative things, and they've been exploring lots of creative ideas, like there's kind of community investment vehicles and other ways in which the people who are in the neighborhood will have the ability to stay, and benefit then from when new development comes in, as opposed to being displaced by new development. We're thinking about, there are amazing things in the south side of Chicago that we're adjacent to, like the where the place where Louis Armstrong, lived. There's just a whole host of, historic sites on the south side of Chicago that people don't know anything about. And, setting up, tour operations where you can spend the morning at the Presidential Center and then jump on a tour bus that will draw you into the neighborhood, which will draw, economic spending into the neighborhood. Those are the kinds of things we're trying to work on.
That's really exciting. I remember, 20 plus years ago, the 3 years that we really were working on designing the exhibits, designing the programs, and part of the challenge was, how do we keep this going, and how do we involve the Clintons in the planning? Like, they clearly had very specific ideas about the building, the programs, the look of it. I'm assuming the Obamas have some interest as well. I'd like to hear a little bit about how they are involved in the planning and execution of your plans.
It turns out we have learned that President Obama is both a frustrated architect and a frustrated interior designer. Because he has taken an active interest, and he surprises us sometimes by the he got really into what the seats in the forum should be. So we've gone through a couple of iterations of fabric or no fabric, color or no color, how long the seating. It was kind of interesting. But he has great taste. So the stuff he picks is just, in the design direction. So he's had a very deep hand in certainly the construction piece of it. They are both, the art is because the two of them are really very interested, patrons of the arts.
Right.
Their own, they're developing their own collection. They really have, developed really great relationships with a broad range of diverse artists, like Maya Lin, who's going to have a water sculpture, on the grounds, and so they've been very, very active on that, and both of them on the programming, right? So the president, the leadership and interacting with young people and building a new generation of young leaders around the world is very much his goal, and so he's very active with our leaders program. He meets with them every year. Mrs. Obama has done several overseas trips to support Girls Opportunity Alliance and our effort to support adolescent girls around the world, and they've both actually given me lots of tasks for how to think about the presidential programming on the campus and expectations there too. So President Obama recently said, we just had our third democracy forum in December, and he said to the room full of donors who were there, he actually believes he will do this. What we do at the foundation will be even more consequential than the work he was able to do in 8 years in the White House. And I think he really believes that even more his personal legacy. It's a little bit what we all saw with President Carter in his recent passing, and how you thought about his post-presidency years. I think you see it in what President Clinton has done. And so, there's that.
And his new book, Citizen, he said this is the most important job he's ever held.
Absolutely.
Yeah. You mentioned the Mrs. Obama's initiative, the Girls Opportunity Alliance, which you obviously had a great hand in helping work on. Can you tell us more about that program? I'm sure people here would be interested to know what it started at and what is it doing now?
Well, the genesis of it really is, so in the second term, we had 3 initiatives, already started. Let's Move on childhood obesity, joining forces on veterans and military families, and Reach Higher for, first generation kids to go to college. And we did not have an international one. And, we were thinking about that. And in October of 2013, Malala Yousafzai came to the United States. She was, I think, 17 at the time with her dad, and came to visit us in the White House. There's a famous photo, which will be in the museum, but you can also find it online, in which of the Oval Office visit with Mrs. Obama and President Obama, and it is the only Oval Office meeting that Malia Obama ever attended. And that's because that morning, Malia was in high school at the time, and when they did their sort of morning at the breakfast table, what are you doing today? And Mrs. Obama says, well, I think your dad and I are meeting, with Malala. Malia said, I want to come. So she did. And the timing of the meeting was perfect. It was after school anyway, and she came, and we did a meeting with just Mrs. Obama and Malia and Malala and her dad, first, and then we walked over to the Oval. And in listening to that, so I got to backbench that meeting together with Susan Rice, our National Security Advisor, and Valerie Jarrett, the President's Senior Advisor. And I walked out and I said, okay, now we have to do adolescent girls education, because when you listen to Malala and the challenges she faced and getting shot in the face, and I remember Mrs. Obama asking her father, how could, because he ran the school that Malala attended when she was shot by the Taliban, and, how can you put your daughter at risk at this, and think about the school and the other girls, and he said, look at her, look at her talent, how could I not have invested in her education? Which, when you hear that kind of dedication to, and that's happening everywhere around the world, whether it's in Afghanistan right now with what's happening, continuing to happen with the Taliban and girls' education, or in places in Africa where girls have to endure gender-based violence to try to go to school, or child marriage, or, the absence of school fees. There's, I think, 62 million girls around the world who are not in, school and cannot complete, adolescent girls, and cannot complete their education. And the numbers just actually sadly rising because of things like the takeover, of Afghanistan and the refugee crisis that we see, when there's a crisis, it is girls' education that more frequently falls off than boys, because girls have to stay home and take care of whatever's happening at home first. And that's, and families do not invest in girls the way they invest in boys. And yet, we know, and Secretary Clinton talks about this all the time, the fastest way to rise GDP of a whole country, let alone a family and a community, is to invest in girls' education, right? The GDP of a whole country rises the more education the young women have, and yet we don't invest in it. So that's what we did. We started Let Girls Learn with that. We've continued it with the Girls Opportunity Lines. And the theory of change there is we learned when we were in the White House and we were thinking about what to do, and we met with experts and most especially activists in the country came to visit with us. And they said to us, I remember Angelique Kidjo actually is the person whose voice often rings in my head with this, and she's very, very active in her home country. And she said, don't come tell us what to do. We know these are our communities. We know what will work and what is needed. Just invest in us as grassroots leaders. And so that's our theory of change, is that, they investing and creating a grant program for grassroots leaders to do the things that they want to do, whether it's build a school in one place or do a leadership program in another place or do healthcare in a third, and then create a network. They all said, we're alone in these villages and cities and places where we work. We need an ongoing network. So we have 4,000 education activists around the world in a network, and we provide them with online training. Periodically, we'll travel and do gatherings with them so that they can share with each other and be a support for each other, especially in this moment in time. And then we're starting in Chicago too. So we are also starting Girls Opportunity Alliance in Chicago, and then we'll expand it in the U.S. And we learned, even though we have, free public education here, girls adolescent girls are still getting left behind in terms of their self-esteem, in terms of the investment in them in their success. In Chicago, because sadly there's so much investment in violence reduction for the boys, the girls often get left behind. And the girls serving organizations, those grassroots organizations that we want to invest in, like there's a great Double Dutch Club, right? And there's a great woman who used a grant from us to buy a mobile van where she just drives around to neighborhoods to do after-school programming for girls in their neighborhood. Those programs aren't getting invested in, so that's what we're trying to do.
That's wonderful. I love how you really underscored the priorities of Mrs. Obama and things that she worked on as the First Lady, and how that work continues today in today's context of how that work is continuing and how it's relevant today. Can you talk a little bit about that on President Obama's side, some of the programs that will, again, pull the thread from his priorities and the accomplishments of the White House, and what do you hope to use and teach people about today and those lessons learned through your programs?
Well, it's very present. I mean, certainly the leadership training program is really about that. So that, especially the Global Leaders Program, which is, cohorts every year in Europe, Asia Pacific, Africa, and then we started 2 years ago a cohort here in the United States. And these are leaders who are learning this values-based, leadership experience. But then more importantly, they all, once they're through any one of our programs, whether it's the college program, the graduate program, or the mid-career program, they become part of the Obama Leaders Network. Because also the vision is that over time you will have thousands of these leaders who have a shared sense of values because of the training they've been through, but are then connected to each other. And that has started. So we have over 1,200 now in the Obama Leaders Network. And the dream always was that they would self-organize themselves. This is how you pull the leadership through, because he often says, I'm passing the torch here and trying to equip you to do that. And those leaders, they're coming together around climate in particular right now, and democracy. Those are the two communities of practice that our Leaders Network are coming together around to do sort of cross-border. For example, the climate team has already done some work at COP, at COP22, I think, to do some, things that are gathering people across, different countries, and then that's the idea. These leader cohorts are not just NGO activists. It's intended to be diverse, not just demographically, but by way of background and experience. So it's government people, military folks, academics, business people, large, big business, small business.
Our Presidential Scholars Program, which we have someone from our program here. That's great. That's really, it's exciting. So I feel like we have an understanding of the programs, and again, pulling that thread from the administration to present day context and how people can continue to stay involved. Talk a little bit how you would like visitors to feel when they leave the Obama Center. What do you hope they take with them?
Oh, great question. So, let me talk about the museum a little bit, sort of what that will be. So the president felt very strongly that the museum exhibition should not start with him. He wanted us to tell the story of the evolution of our country. So the first floor, when you enter the museum exhibits, will actually start with the Constitution. So it starts with the Constitution and tells a story of how we evolved towards a more perfect union. So from the start of the Constitution, through the Civil War, through the progressive movement, the Civil Rights movement, the election of Harold Washington, it's not till the end of the floor that you then get to Barack and Michelle Obama and their story in the South Side, and then election night around the world. So he really wanted to pull that thread of democracy and our evolution and on whose shoulders he stood for his presidency. And then even as you go up to the upper floors, so the next level up is, about the administration work, sort of, about healthcare or about education or about the military. But in each of those, we try to highlight not just the work of the administration, but the individuals who affected it. And the theme there is, throughout the museum is in a democracy, your individual voice, when joined together with others, the kind of change you can make. So, for example, in the ACA story, the Affordable Care Act, we talk about Natoma Canfield, who was an incredible cancer survivor, whose voice became very important during that push. And then we'll have interactive stations placed where we ask people prompts, what would you do, in this situation? How could that come together? And then the next floor up is Life in the White House. That's sort of the fun floor, as you know. It's like the dresses, Bo and Sunny, music in the White House. And then the top floor will be an interactive exhibit about challenging. It'll be, sort of, without getting too far down the path, because we haven't fully unveiled it yet, but we'll have an amazing digital artist who's creating an incredible interactive exhibit for us, where you can sort of see your individual dot, joining with others, to do something, and then asking and prompting people, we hope, so what can you do, from something small, like just attending a school board meeting in your town, to much larger, running for office, right? We want people to feel engaged through all of that.
That's really interesting, and a little factoid for you all. I think it's interesting that the exhibit designer that you chose to design all your exhibits is the same exhibit designer, Ralph Applebaum Associates, who designed the exhibits here at the Clinton Center and are working very closely with our team for our new exhibits and to sort of update all the technology and really energize the stories that are told in the museum. So that's really fun, and they're so great to work with. And I know we're even working with some of the same people. So.
Oh, we are. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's been fun, which is great, because then they bring this sort of knowledge, right, of what works and what doesn't work, but how to push the envelope, in a new direction. So yeah.
I love that. That reminds me, when I first left the White House, and I had no idea about designing a presidential center, a presidential library. It was very much of like, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to build this bus and drive it at the same time. So I went to visit some of the other presidential libraries, and I was embarrassed to say I'd never been to a presidential library. And it was so surprising to me, and I don't know if you felt this way, and wonderful that like partisanship, like it's not part of the conversation. The Bush 41 library, when I went there first, I couldn't believe how warm and how they wanted to share. They wanted to share with me mostly like, here's all the things you shouldn't do that didn't work for us.
We've had that conversation.
Here's all the things, and here's some things you should do in your museum store. And I was just like, wow, like they don't see us as competition.
No. Well, as you know, we're all part. We're all part of a lot of interactive things. Some through the National Archives, some through other gatherings like More Perfect, which is a gathering of all of us, and some just individually like this. Where there is there aren't actually. Secretary Clinton used to say this a lot. It's just kind of a small club. It's a small club of former presidents. It's a small club of former first ladies. It's a small club of people who've held staff positions that we have held. Small club of presidential libraries. And so, just staying in touch with each other, doing joint things. There is a very warm relationship between the Bushes and the Obamas. All that the sort of like punch that, President Bush just recently gave President Obama at the Carter funeral, if you saw that. That is like for real. That was that was a bro punch, on just the two of them. And they have that is actually a very real, which I honestly, never thought, as hard fought as we were, if you think about, we just succeeded him in a very contentious, debate about his policies when we were running in 2008, and the idea that we have, have shared this very warm, which we have and do have, relationship is this testament to sort of that's what the country is about.
It really is, and it was very similar with President Clinton and President Bush 41. Obviously, he did not have a second term because President Clinton beat him, and I'm sure he says there were some tough feelings on both sides, but the relationship that they began because President Bush 43 asked them to work on tsunami relief, and it's blossomed, and it's really wonderful, the partnerships we have working with each other. Do you have any other plans or thoughts about some partnerships with presidential centers or other key partners that you all are working with
Well,
program?
as you know, we're
Yeah.
all thinking about America 250.
Oh, yes.
So, the July 4th, 2026 is the 250th anniversary of the Declaration. And, we are actively, thinking about that and
Right.
thinking about it together in partnership, I think with the other presidential centers,
Mm-hmm.
with some foundations, with the More Perfect, coalition. And I think sort of more to come on that. For us, it's kind of interesting because we will open in the spring of 26, and then close on the heels of that will be July 4th, 2026. So, I've just been working with my team and thinking, that will be our first big
Oh,
tentpole
right.
moment, right, on the campus. How do we project the campus out, in that moment of, national celebration? How do we position ourselves around that, and what will we do, and do it in a way that is resonant with what may be happening here, what may be happening in Texas. I think there's a real opportunity, to sort of show in that bipartisan way, what the presidency is about, what the democracy is about, what our
And
democracy is
people, I
about.
think, really yearn to see that now. With our country being so divided, like even seeing the Clintons and the Bushes and the funny interaction at the funeral, like that, I think people, like that's reassuring to know that our democracy continues and that those relationships and the work that they do continue really across party lines.
I think that's a story to tell that we
It
have to
is.
keep telling.
Right.
And there's a little bit about that story of the individual in our museum, which is, I think there's a disconnect when you say democracy to like, okay, what is that doing to my egg prices or not?
Right.
Right? And people have lost that connection about how what your vote is then
Right.
translate to then what policy is, that then translate to what your egg prices are, that then translates to what democracy is. And presidential centers are a way to make that real, using the lessons of history, projecting those lessons of history forward, into the present, and relating that then to people's individual lives.
Right. And I think, again, giving people, specifically young people, opportunities to practice what that means. How do you vote? What does that mean? Why does my vote matter? How to be a young leader. Talk a little bit about what's your advice to some of the young people here who might be considering a career in public service?
Well, look, first of all, the thing that I sometimes say about public service that, it's not the serious policy. You can change lives and, change the course, of major events, which is all true, and it's incredible. But, it's always also, I have made the best friends in my life. I mean, really the best friends in my life from doing this work. Like, I've got work friends, and that's great. But really, some of the women who I put that march together with are my friends to this day, some 40 years later. And it's true for the campaigns. I know everybody who's in Clinton world feels the same way as those of us in Obama world, which is it's like a big family. We're 12 years out, and it is still a big family. And people show up for each other.
Oh my gosh, we just
when
had
one
our
of us runs for office, we show up there. When and so that's a part of the rewarding aspect that I think is worth mentioning. That you can find it not just to be rewarding work substantially, but personally rewarding work. And then, I often say this to people. People forget that actually the better part of my career was 23 years working for a big corporate law firm. Okay, so it was not full time doing this. I was doing this all as a side hustle, meaning being involved in not-for-profit organizations on the board of, or being involved. I've worked a lot on abortion, rights and electing abortion folks, as my colleagues from PAWPAC know, in Illinois, and it's through that other doors opened. That's how I got to know Barack and Michelle Obama, but also how we got to stay engaged, both in a professional career, as an attorney, and then doing this work. And you can do that. It can be incredibly fun and exciting.
As we kind of wrap up here, give us something. I mean, I love the word hope. It was so important to Bill Clinton, the man from hope. That's his life story began in hope. And obviously with President Obama.
Hope and change.
Hope and change. So that hope. What can you tell our audience here? What can you tell the young people? Give us some hope for the future. Give us some hope. Give us your perspective. Tough question.
A little bit of a tall order there,
Obviously, none of this
Stephanie.
is on the card, so.
It's a bit of the top,
Yeah.
but look, I mean, and I'll channel a little bit of the boss here
Yeah.
because he's done this, you know, in the last year or so with a lot of our young people when he's met with leaders, and I've watched him do that. You know, and he said, all right, you know, think back. Like this is, you know, times may be hard and there are things that are struggles, but, you know, some of the people who brought us here, Edmund Pettus Bridge, you know, were getting beaten to an inch of their lives on Edmund Pettus Bridge, or having dogs and fire hose turned on them, or go back even further, you know, we're, you know, fighting wars, civil war, you know, in this country. So, you know, there are hard times, and we have been through hard times. I do think we may be in an Edmund Pettus Bridge moment for many of us here, where, you know, there's courage that's required, and persistence that's going to be required. But, you know, I do believe in democracy. I do believe that the foundational underpinnings of this country are strong. You know, they've lasted 249 years. You know, if you believe, you know, in democracy and the ability of people's voices to be heard, if you can create the pathways for that to happen, then it's, you know, it will happen. And sometimes it has to start small. You know, sometimes it's just in your community.
Right.
Right? Or it's just around a park district issue, or a school board issue, or a state house issue. But then that builds and it accumulates. And, you know, there were many years where I didn't agree with the President of the United States in the White House. It's interesting because I think for a lot of people, the young people who grew up in the Obama world, they didn't realize that, like, you and I spent years growing up, you know, you know, with people in the White House that we didn't agree with, or in the State House in Illinois that I didn't agree with. We were a Republican state, people forget, for a very, very long time. And yet you just got to keep working at what, you know, what you believe in, and, you know, and trust, go back to the foundations of why do you believe in that, and why are you doing this work, and what's the effect on the people that you care about, you know, and that's, you know, I think about the girls, you know, a lot of times when you know, I'm fortunate to have several pictures. There's one when I speak, I sometimes use of a girl from Liberia she and I are exchanging a moment sitting at a classroom table, and it's like she's carrying water, you know, to her home at 4 o'clock in the morning in the dark before she walks a couple of miles to school. Well, that's what she's doing. So if she's doing that, then look, I can do whatever the thing is that's in front of us right now.
Well, this has been a fascinating, wonderful conversation. Appreciate you sharing some inside information with us about the Obama Center. We are excited. We love the opportunity for us to work together, and just really appreciate you making time to come and share your vision and share some of your fun stories with our friends here today.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me.
Yeah.